This is CSaP's Science and Policy Podcast from the University of Cambridge, where we're bringing you the latest evidence and expertise to improve public policymaking. So welcome everyone to the second episode in the Centre for Science and Policy's podcast series looking at genetic technologies. Last week, we had a great discussion about some of the regulatory context for discussions about genome editing in agriculture and why the UK is turning to this question at the moment. In this week's episode, we're joined by Tina Barsby, a plant scientist and chief executive of NIAB, which was founded over 100 years ago now as the National Institute of Agricultural Botany and continues to do work in crop science and working with farmers. And Jack Stilgoe, a senior lecturer in the social studies of science from UCL, whose research focuses on new and emerging technologies and what they mean for society and what society means for them. So it's great to be joined by you both. Tina, if I may, so if you cast your mind back, what were some of the issues that motivated public concern and controversy about genetic technologies in agriculture 20 or so years ago?
As you were saying, cast your mind back, I was casting my mind back to when I was working in the lab and I was working on nematode resistance in potato in collaboration with a group at the University of Durham. And I was thinking, wow, what a great thing this will be for organic farmers, because the pesticide that was used to control nematodes at the time was actually a biocide. It was banned in most of Europe, and it was soon to be banned in the UK. And we had a control that was pretty effective. And it came as a huge shock to me that the organic movement was against what I saw as something very natural compared to what we had been facing. And I suppose, but as a scientist in the lab, we then became put into the position of having to defend this against arguments that really were not scientific, that we weren't qualified to respond to. And I suppose that's carried on ever since. Eventually, I realized that there were people whose whole careers had been built on being anti-genetic modification, just in the same way that, you know, my own career had up until that time been built on trying to improve crops by genetic modification and other means. So, yeah, it was a bit of a shock, and I'd be very interested in Jack's perspective on what happened and why.
What, from your perspective, are the issues that are really, you think, ought to come to the fore now that Defra has launched the consultation on genome editing in agriculture? What do you think is the opportunities that we ought to have in mind when we think about this new technology and what sense to make of it in the context of agriculture?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that we're often asked, and actually throughout my career I've been asked, well, if we have this technology, what new and wonderful crop could we have? What new and wonderful thing could we have? And it's always really difficult to answer that question, because my new and wonderful thing might not be that exciting to you. You know, if I'm a farmer, I could cite virus-resistant sugar beet, which probably means very little to most people, but could mean much less or no use of pesticides on those crops at certain times. And we know of the controversy around bees and neonicotinoids. So there are some examples like that. There are some food examples. I used to work on starch modification and the idea that we could make starch more resistant, more digestible in the gut is also quite attractive. But I think it's actually bigger than that. If you think that now we have genome sequences of almost all of the crops out there in the world. And we also have good knowledge of what those genes are doing, what the proteins are doing, and good knowledge of where we'd like to change them. And genome editing allows us to do that, in a sense, in a more directed way than we could in the past. So I don't think it's helpful to think of specific cases all the time. It's better to think of it as something that opens up science.
And do you see genome editing as significantly different from the sort of recombinant DNA technologies that have been the forefront of this discussion in last few decades?
Recently, I and others have been thinking about that quite carefully. So there are some similarities between genome editing and genetic modification in that they're both carried out in the laboratory and they both need a way to carry that edit, that change into the plant cell. And we sometimes can think of using the same methods. But one of the things about genome editing that is the most interesting is that some genome edits don't introduce any foreign DNA or any DNA at all. They just make changes to the plant's existing DNA in exactly the same way as a mutation does. And I know the word mutation, for some people who are not familiar with it, can be quite a scary word. But if you think about mutations as the things that make our eye colours different, the colours of plants in our gardens different, then gene editing is just another way to create a mutation. But importantly, you're only creating that mutation, whereas all of the other methods will create mutations in other parts of the genome. So when a plant breeder wants to make a change, they literally use irradiation or a chemical treatment to make mutations throughout the genome. And then they look in those plants that they've modified for the characteristic that they want. And undoubtedly, there'll be other things that they don't want in there that has to be sorted out.
So that's interesting that you highlight the point that genome editing can be used to make adjustments, alterations to a plant's genome without introducing any DNA from another species. Is that scientifically or agronomically significant, or is that to you significant because of what you think are public concerns about GM technology?
I think primarily because of public concerns, because you could argue that DNA is DNA, and sometimes it's in one order and that gives us one organism, and sometimes it's in another order and that gives us another organism. But it's not fundamentally different. But I believe one of the issues that people have is that they don't like the idea of DNA in one species being introduced into another species which they're going to eat, even though we think that historically this may have happened in nature anyway.
So that's really, interesting that we've got a sort of a really coming together of what's technically and scientifically possible, what's kind of possible from a regulatory point of view, with what we or others think are, underlying issues of public concern. So it's important then, I suppose, that we have a good understanding of what those public issues are. So maybe turn to Jack here and ask you, a sort of similar set of questions, really, but from the point of view of what's motivated public interest and public concern. Are we looking at something different now with the possibilities of genome editing, or do you see it very much as a continuum with some of the concerns that were raised over the last, around the year 2000, when public controversy in the UK was at its height around GM foods?
I don't know. I think that is what is to be tested, right? It's what is to be tested through consultation, through dialogue, through laboratory experimentation, and I guess through what we might see as the sort of broader experiment, that the experiment of science in society. Clearly, as Tina describes, a new set of laboratory interventions brings novel possibilities. We know that novel possibilities are always accompanied by new questions, and the possibilities and the questions will be understood differently by scientists, by companies looking to make money from particular technological interventions, by, in this case, farmers, by philanthropists, whose interest might be, in quotes, feeding the world, by members of the public, by NGOs, right? They will have a different sense of what's new here. So I think the question, given the, as you say, fraught history of public engagement and public dialogue, some of it organized, some of it extremely disorganized, about genetic modification for agriculture, is, does genome editing allow us to escape some of those concerns? Does it exacerbate some of those concerns? Should it allow researchers and companies to escape the regulatory tangle that has grown up around the first generation of genetically modified crops? And, the reason I say I don't know is because I guess the first time around, scientists and the companies that were looking to use the technologies were taken by surprise by the scale and nature of public and NGO concerns. So I wouldn't want to see complacency this time around either. I've heard some noises off in the scientific community along the lines of, oh, well, here is something that allows us to put that debate behind us. Now, that might be true if you imagine particular concerns, as Tina said, to do with transgenic interventions, right? But if we see public concerns as much about the ownership of technology and the question of who benefits from technology, as the particular novel risks created through an intervention and the uncertainties around the assessment of those risks, then that becomes a much more difficult thing, right? How are we to reassure ourselves that this time around we won't get into a situation where, on the one hand, we have some scientists with humanitarian instincts saying this is a technology that will allow us to feed the world, while at the same time you have big agribusiness in the US saying this is a technology that will allow us to capture, control agricultural markets in new ways, right? And I'm not convinced that that link has been broken. And I think that's what needs more exploration.
So I'm also concerned about that. And I know that's what happened the first time around. We as scientists in public laboratories suddenly turned around and found that the things that we were doing, the components we were putting together, were owned by somebody. So there were patents flying around. And, everybody tried to patent something in this area. And that could still be a concern. The other concern around that is that with genetic modification, the cost of taking something through the regulatory process has been so high that only those big multinational companies could afford to do it. So one of the attractions, if gene editing is put into the same category as conventionally bred mutations, then we could imagine that even public sector organizations could bring forward things which might have no commercial benefit, but have benefits to sustainability and general public benefit. So it's a fine line, but that's what I would like to see.
I'd like to ask Jack to reflect on, I think what you've said is that, we understand now a fair bit about what motivated some of the opposition to genetic modification in agriculture 20 years ago. And that included, as you said, questions of who benefits, who's controlling this technology, how's it going to shape the kind of wider food and agricultural system, questions about uncertainty and unintended consequences, and who is going to worry about those on behalf of wider society. Those are some of the contours that we're pretty confident explain quite a bit of controversy. Now, moving to 2021, do you have a sense of whether those underlying issues are likely to, I know you've said you don't know, but can you speculate whether those underlying issues are likely to emerge again, or do you feel that we've got no reason to think that will be the case?
All I can point to are the little sort of anticipatory moments from the consultation so far, right? We've seen some of the anti-GM groups come out against gene editing technologies, and we could maybe seek to understand, well, where are they coming from? And I guess there's one argument that's about a sort of Trojan horse, right? Is there a danger that this is a technology that is represented as different, but is actually, maybe it's not a Trojan horse, maybe it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? It's the same old technology dressed up in a new garb, and it's just a way for big business to enter new markets. In our case, right, the European market, where these companies were sort of frozen out from developing genetically modified technologies for a long time. But I think we can also see that the sorts of concerns that Tina expressed, that a lot of scientists have been expressing, as they have made sense of the controversy around genetically modified crops, right, maybe those concerns could be exacerbated through genome editing. I haven't followed the debate close enough to know what that means in terms of intellectual property. Does it make a thing harder to patent or easier to patent? Does it increase the propensity for ownership of a particular genetic sequence or the reverse? So I don't see any evidence that those concerns have gone away. There is a sort of optimism that, the public mood has shifted. And, simply because we haven't talked about genetically modified crops for the last 20 years, the easy explanation for that is that there's been nothing to talk about. And so the danger is when you're asked to have this conversation again, what direction can it take? And it can spin quite quickly in a direction that certainly scientists who are looking to research these things, right, let alone commercialize them, could find rather uncomfortable.
So can I say, you said that the multinational companies were frozen out of Europe. So just as an interjection, that the farmers were frozen out of using some of the technologies that genetic modification brought, but genetically modified crops were still imported to Europe. Genetically modified, all of the animals we eat, or most of them, are fed on genetically modified soybean that's imported into the EU. And even though soybean doesn't grow in UK very well, it does grow in other parts of Southern Europe, and those people have been allowed to grow that crop, which which is imported from North America. So it's for the farmer, it's quite a different story. And I don't think those so the people working on genetically modified soybean, the companies with that technology for the soybean didn't. It was not to their detriment at all. They were still able to sell their wares in Europe. So that's been a bit of a strange thing. It's been we haven't wanted to grow it, but we've been happy to feed it to our animals.
In a way, kind of regulations, and it sort of always a sort of a kind of always an incomplete kind of expression of contesting and contradictory views. I think that's just almost inevitable. Tina, I wonder if you could respond to Jack's question about whether genome editing does actually change the kind of intellectual property question about crops and agriculture.
I don't know. I'm not close enough to that. But I do know that the patenting frenzy has quietened down in this area over the years as things have gone through the system, and it's become more obvious what patent legislation will accept and not accept. And so there are, I'm sure there are patents, but it would be very difficult. Let me take the virus-resistant sugar beet. It would be very difficult to protect something like that because there's so much out there in the public domain already. So I think there may be some things, but they'd have to be very valuable to be worth patenting, because patenting is a very expensive business.
So I think that's really interesting, because it strikes me one of the potential positive directions that could come out of the fraught history that I sort of sketched earlier is, a clearer sense of what public good agricultural biotechnology looks like, so that especially publicly funded scientists don't find that they are accidentally or through negligence entangled in corporate research agendas. Right, so that you have a sense of what might the food crops be that the world needs, rather than what might the food crops be that give us access to markets, and that those aren't necessarily the same things. And I think one of the problems that university scientists got into in the late 90s and early 2000s is that GM, genetic modification, was seen as one thing. Right, it was seen as science that then could be applied in multiple ways. Yes. But big business's voice won through. And I think there's a question about what public good gene editing looks like, and how university scientists might assert their ownership of that trajectory, so that there's a slightly more sort of diverse debate, rather than people, members of the public, consumers, people who just engage with this on the supermarket shelves, rather than being forced to say GM yes or no, gene editing yes or no. You can have a discussion about, well, what does good gene editing look like?
I think there's another thing that I would like to see aired, and that is that plant breeders do a lot of things already which the public don't know about. And so again, going back in my own history, I was really surprised when GM suddenly became negatively considered because I'd previously worked on protoplast fusion, where you remove the cell walls from two cells, you bring together two species which don't normally cross, and those species then exchange their mitochondria, and one of them becomes male sterile, and that gives you a hybrid. And I believe that almost all of the cauliflower that you eat has a cytoplasm made in that way. But it was decided that technology was excluded from the European regulations, and therefore there was no debate. There are many other things that are done in conventional plant breeding, none quite so sophisticated as that, which I think people are just not aware of.
I mean, one thing I wonder, Tina, thinking of this conversation, is that if we're thinking about the innovation of new approaches to crops, the way we've talked about it just now, to me, it speaks to the fact that it's about the sort of the science of genetics, plus then breeding, plus then the different routes to the field and commercialization. It's also about then social questions of consumers and farmers and the model of agriculture people are keen to see supported and developed. So really success will require, to my mind, at least as much attention to the sort of the social and development and commercialization as to the intricate science. And yet my sense is over the last decade or two, there hasn't quite been the ingenious attention paid to those social sets of questions that have been paid to the molecular biology. It seems to be potentially a little bit out of kilter. Do you see any way of there being a kind of, on the research and development side, a way to combine those two worlds of concern?
As a physical scientist, it's quite difficult for me to envisage that. But yes, we need to bring in other disciplines, so people who understand these issues in a completely different way. But I do think it must be possible to have that debate. There will always be people who are against technology. I mean, Jack must know that. There will always be people who are against the new technology. And I wonder, one question I wanted to ask him actually was, how much of that is about them not understanding what it is? I mean, I remember coming home one day from work and hearing on the radio that most people thought that the only way genes got into tomatoes were if they were put there by meddling scientists. So I do wonder whether these misunderstandings are at the root of people's...
I think, the social science evidence on this because as you can imagine, the GM crops controversy was big. There was a lot of investment into understanding the roots of public concern, and also understanding scientists' ideas of what the public were concerned about. And I think the evidence was that actually public misunderstandings don't contribute much to public concerns, which is, certainly there was misinformation. And if you're an NGO, and the incentives to prey on particular public nervousness and maybe spread in misinformation. But actually, in most cases, it was just that public concerns were about different things, right? That they were wondering, well, what is the basis for the risk assessment? How much do we know about the safety of these things, given that they're new technologies? Why should I eat this? What does it give me as a consumer? What does it give us as a family? What does it give us as a nation? And how does it benefit people that have lost out from previous agricultural innovation? So a layer of nested concerns, and actually scientific misunderstanding explains a tiny fraction of that. I think part of the problem, though, is that some of the institutions of science at the time allowed themselves hubristically to interpret the problem as one of public misunderstanding. So because then it becomes amenable to solution. Oh, in that case, then we just need to educate people. And yes, that it would be nice if that were true, but the evidence is that wasn't the cause of people's concern, nor does that approach work very much.
I think we're just beginning the conversation, but our time is rapidly coming to an end. I think that we are in the midst of a live experiment because the consultation is open. I mean, and it's crystal clear what the Secretary of State in Defra thinks a good outcome from that consultation would be, which is to say that if, the genome editing opens up new opportunities that can enable British agriculture and to move forward, taking advantage of some aspects of genome editing. But we shall see. We shall see what kinds of debates crystallize around this consultation. I think that whatever the outcome of the consultation, I think that because food and farming is so important to so many people, there's not going to be a single resolution to what is the right way for innovation to shape developments in food and farming. And so, I would like to see more sustained, more intelligent discussion that brings together some of the social and the agronomic and the scientific aspects. So I hope we can convene again in a few months' time. CSaP's Science and Policy podcast is a production of the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. The series is hosted by me, Dr. Rob Doubleday, and is produced by Kate McNeil, with the support of research assistant Alice Millington. You can learn more about CSaP's work by visiting us on Twitter @CSciPol, or by visiting our website at www.csap.cam.ac.uk. If you've any feedback about this episode or questions you'd like to address in the future, please email us at inquiries@csap.cam.ac.uk. Thanks for listening.